Welcome back to a new video on Retro Games Now. Yes, that's right. I am installing a mod chip on my PS2 in 2025. This is a mod chip I always wanted to install and see what all the fuss was about, although I arrived at the scene 20 years late. Sit back and relax as I walk you through all the steps I took to achieve this installation. Keep in mind, I am not a professional. I'm just another video game hobbyist who is learning how to do this from the community. Don't take my tips to heart and explore and experiment with mods at your own pace and skill, because this one was certainly challenging. I started the process by preparing the modbo 5 first, applying solder to all the pads, cutting the wire, stripping the silicone from the tip, applying flux to each end and soldering it onto the corresponding pad. I have to say that this was really my second attempt at installing this mod chip because the first attempt did not work out. I'll save the details about that for another video. Please leave your like, comment, and subscribe to Retro Games Now for more content. It helps me out a lot. After soldering all the wires into the pads, I used super glue to attach all the wires together. I decided to take a different approach to wire management than what I have usually seen other modders do, which is soldering the wires onto the points on the board first, then doing the wire management after, and then soldering each opposite ends of the wires to the modbo 5. I am doing the opposite here. I tried that in my first attempt and I didn't like how it turned out. I don't think my problems with the first attempt were related to wire management though, but I just wanted to try something different than what people typically do for wire management. Besides, I realized that doing the wire management over the board leads to leaving superglue residue behind on the PCB, and that really bothers me. This way I apply superglue on top of the wires away from the PCB. As you can see here, I repeated the same process on this side of the modbo, cutting the wire, stripping it, applying paste flux, and soldering it onto the corresponding pad of the modbo 5. I applied some IPA to brush down the mod chip to remove all the spent flux. I forgot to mention the wires I used for this install were 30 American wire gauge silicone stranded electric wire. This type of wire gave me some problems along the way. If you look closely when I pre-tin each wire, if I approached the tip of my iron at a wrong angle, I could get the strands to easily become undone, and then it became very difficult to straighten them out like they were after stripping the silicone off. The reason I decided to use this type of wire was because of the colors of the silicone wrapping. I wanted to give this install an appealing look. If I were to recommend a better wire for this, I would go for 30 American wire gauge single core wire, as that is way easier to manage when it comes to micro soldering. As you can see, I straightened out the wires in a line, and then I will place the modbo 5 on the board, peel off each wire, cut it to length, strip the silicone, apply flux, and pre-tin, and then solder the end to the point on the board. If you look closely, I created a bridge here, but I will clear it in a moment. One thing I decided to leave in the footage was this moment where I picked the wrong wire, and it wasn't until later that I realized this. I was supposed to solder wire O, not Q. I also want to point out how I cleared out that bridge you see next to the legs by the black wire. Here I moved the wires out of the way to tuck the blue wire in. I hadn't realized yet this was wrong, but look at what happens next. I soldered the wire, but the bridge between the pins was still there. I tried using a piece of wick to clear the bridge, and it started getting messy. Leaving strands of copper behind. All I had to do was clean the tip of my iron and come back and do a swiping motion across the pins of the IC chip, which I believe is the BIOS specifically. Then I came back and soldered the wire. And finally, right here is when I realized the wire was wrong. I had to desolder it from the IC and the modbo and replace it with a new blue wire, and then I grabbed the correct wire, which was the green one, 4.0. I peeled away the green wire, cut it to length, passed it under the red and yellow wire, stripped the silicone, applied flux, pre-tinned it, and soldered it into place, which was very easy for this point. I was a little surprised they got it almost right away. I repeat the same process for points N and M. After I soldered all 4 wires, I tested for continuity, and you will have to excuse me here because my microscope did not pick up the audio, so you won't hear a beep. And you will just have to take my word for it that this was making a good connection. Since I had to replace the blue wire, I needed to reattach it to the group of wires with more super glue. But I placed a piece of Kapton tape under the wires so that the super glue didn't get all over the chip below the wires. Now we will focus on points Q, T, U, V, R, and W. Some points were easy to solder the wire to, and some were not, as you will see in the footage. I will keep repeating this because it is a technique that really helps and is important. Applying flux to the wire, pre-tinning it, and then soldering it to the point on the board is easy this way. After I completed all the points, once again I tested for continuity, but you won't hear the beeps. They were there and the connections were good. I sprayed contact cleaner and brushed the surface off. This also is a good opportunity to make sure the wires are soldered well onto the points. This next part was very challenging. My goal here was to install the wires for A, B, G, H, and I right on the legs of the IC chip. It is well known these are very difficult to solder to because of the narrow pitch between the legs of this IC chip. I tried anyway, and you'll see how difficult it was. Keep in mind this footage is fast forwarded 500%, so I was going real slow. Once again, using stranded wire added a lot more difficulty as the strands easily become undone. So you must make sure to pre-tin the stranded wire really well before attempting to solder it in place. I managed to get point A, and now I'm trying point B. A little bit of bridging happened while I was doing this, but remember to clean off your soldering iron, and that alone helps the solder to retract or flow better. And I cleared the bridge. In this footage, you can see that the wires for G and H are missing from the Modbo 5. What happened was that I made a genuine attempt to solder points G, H, and I, but it was way too difficult for all the reasons already mentioned, including the fact that these three legs of the IC chip are right next to each other. I decided I wasn't going to spend any more time trying and opted for soldering these wires to the alternative points on the board. This is why here I am soldering new wires and starting over, and then I arranged and glued them together so they looked neat. I decided to install the remaining wires on this side of the board before going to the opposite side and install these alternate points. In order, I installed point CX, SX, and then point Y. Now that we're done with that side of the board, we'll flip it and focus on the alternate points I mentioned before. When installing these points, you do need to remove a bit of solder mask from these points to reveal more of the copper and place a bead of solder so the stranded wire attaches to it correctly. Then I attached the wires together and applied super glue as I've done so far. I wasn't completely done on the other side of the board, so here I am installing the 3.3 volt line and ground. Now I do need to point out here that the wire used for this connection must be a thicker gauge. And the way I sourced this wire, I have to say I was proud. It was simple, but one gets in the habit of trying to buy all the supplies needed instead of looking at what you already have in hand. Simple. I thought about a USB-A to micro USB cable and how I have many laying around in my office. Then I looked up what these cables are typically made of, and sure enough, they have two wires in them. At least that is the case if they are only for charging. The black wire is ground and the red wire is for voltage, typically rated for 5 volts, and both are 24 American wire gauge. So I sacrificed a USB-A to micro USB cable I wasn't using. I cut the ends, peeled the black silicone wrapping, and pulled out this red and black wire from inside. Cut a couple of lengths and used them here. And then it was a matter of routing these two wires in a way that made sense like I did here. This is the last wire needed for the modbo 5, the reset wire. I cut it to length so it wasn't too long, pre-tinned it, and soldered it in its corresponding point. I sprayed a lot of contact cleaner at this point and used a dedicated toothbrush. Scrubbed all the surfaces. And in doing so, the wire going to point SX came loose, and that's good. It's a good thing this happens. That way you get an opportunity to solder it down correctly like I'm doing here. It's always recommended to tug on the wire a little bit to ensure the connection is solid. Now the same thing happened over here with point W. I soldered it back on. And while I was using a Q-tip, another wire came loose, and I took care of that by soldering it back into place. The rest of the work was spot cleaned with the Q-tip doused with alcohol. But as you can see, another wire came loose as well. This was point I, the alternative solder point. I soldered it back into place and cleaned this area. Finally, the modbo 5 install is complete. Now we will focus on installing this PicFix modification. I sourced this little board from Modsville, USA. I found out that certain revisions of the PS2, a scratched or poorly burned or original CD or DVD media, can crash the Mechacon. This would result in the laser burning itself out. What this PicFix does essentially is if the Mechacon crashes, it will force the console into standby mode, preventing the laser from burning out. I may not have mentioned it until now, but this board I am working on is a V9 GH-023. I decided to arrange the wires in a similar manner and attach them together with super glue. One thing that needs to be pointed out when using this PicFix is, depending on the version board you have, a specific connection needs to be bridged on the PicFix board, which enables one of two different resistors that come on the board. As you can see here in the picture, one has a 2K ohm resistance and the other is a 1.5K ohm resistance. If you look closely, I bridged points 1 and 2 that are right under these resistors. The location I decided to place the PicFix was interesting. Since I chose to attach the 4 wires together for wire management, I thought it would be a cool idea to have the wires pass under the other wires of the modbo 5, and that's what I did here. Now, admittedly, point J on the PicFix is close by, and I could have made that wire short, but again, I was going more for an aesthetic look, as you'll see here. At least for me. Installing the 5-volt line was simple enough, and the leg of this voltage regulator was pre-tinned from the first attempt, so it was a lot quicker to solder the wire down here. Then I installed point K to this resistor. And finally, I installed the ground wire to the edge of the board. Ensured all the connections are solid by checking continuity, and they are. Then I cleaned each point with a Q-tip and alcohol. Thus concluding the installation of the PicFix. And as a finished touch, I placed Kapton tape on top of the modbo chip, another piece on top of the pick fix so that the solder points do not make contact with the shielding and short. And finally, I place a piece of electric tape to hold these wires in place. Thank you for watching.